This week we'll be covering the first part of the MX5 engine and gearbox swap into my MGB Roadster. I'll talk you through my reasoning behind choosing this particular engine swap in this car, and I'll also cover how I've mounted the engine and gearbox, how I made the exhaust manifold and downpipe, and some other performance and lightweight modifications. Today we'll be talking about the MX5 drivetrain swap that I've been doing on the MGB Roadster, and I'll cover a little bit about why I've chosen that engine and gearbox over anything else. About 7 or 8 months ago, the B series in this car started showing signs of weakness. The oil pressure was dropping. I ultimately checked the compression, and the compression of the engine was down 7 to 1. I've done around 26,000 miles in this car in the last 2 years. When I got the car, there was an issue with like a sand sediment in the fuel tank. Eventually that worked its way through into the engine. I ended up replacing the cylinder heads because the valves were badly scored, and ultimately I think that's what's led to the demise. It had nearly 90,000 miles on this engine, which I think by today's standards not a lot, but on an older engine, is it ready for rebuild? Possibly coming up to that kind of time anyway. With the damage on the cylinders being pretty bad then, there was like a 0.5 to a 1mm lip. Pot 3 was the worst one, which you can see here. With this being a car that I wanted to keep, it made sense to rebuild the engine rather than fit another used unit which I might end up replacing in another year's time. I was getting quotes for a rebore and a regrind, new pistons, bottom end bearings and rings, and it was coming in at around £700, and that's with me doing a lot of the work myself as well. It just didn't seem to make sense financially, which is why I opted for the MX5 engine swap over an engine rebuild. You can pick these engines up for around £150 with a gearbox. They're that common in the UK that they seem to be worth buttons at the moment. Having in the past used existing cars, ECUs and looms, it made sense for me to go to a standalone system on this car. Which is quite an outlay cost up front. Even a used standalone ECU coming back at around £500. I wanted something that I was familiar with, which is why I went with the Emerald, because my other MG runs an Emerald and also the 504 pickup truck. They're both on Jag 3-litre V6 engines. The reason that I've not followed suit and fit the V6 to this Roadster is purely around economy. I use this car every day and I do quite a lot of miles in it, so I don't really want to be putting a V6 in there. The other thing as well is there's not a lot of room in the engine bay once you've done the V6 conversion. Exhausts have always been a little bit of an issue, trying to get them tucked underneath the car if you want a low ride height. So that's the reason that I ran the side exit exhaust on my other MGB. And the MX5 engines, obviously being cheap and easy to replace, it kind of made sense to go down that route. There's a lot of animosity towards this engine swap in the MG world, I seem to find. It's one of those where people are thinking, is it worth really fitting another 1.8 litre modern engine, getting all the added costs that you're getting from the engine conversion when you're just replacing an 1800 with an 1800 engine? When you start looking at the power, around 120 horsepower is kind of the max that you'll see out of an 8-valve B series engine. The MX5 sort of starts around that point. So if you were looking to sort of maintain the original Mazda ECU and keep the 120 horsepower, it is one of those where it's touch and go. Are you better off just spending the money on a B series and saving a lot of time and effort? But when you look at it from a weight saving perspective, the original B series engines weigh in at around 200 kilo. On top of that, you've got an overdrive gearbox, which is another 50 odd kilo. This entire engine, gearbox, all ancillaries, flywheel, clutch, everything fitted, weighed in at 167 kilos. We should be looking at saving around 100 to 150 kilos from this conversion. On top of that, the B series on the motorway, you might get 30 to the gallon. I've known people fit these engines to MGBs and they're getting around 40 to the gallon, so there's a good cost saving there if you're doing a lot of miles over a year. This time out, I'm going to show you more about how I fit the engine. There'll be a bit about the exhaust manifold build, gearbox mountings and engine mountings will be covered. And then there'll also be a couple of other little simple tricks that I'll be doing as well to try and save some weight, but also worthwhile upgrades at the same time, in my opinion. The first job then to chip away everything that's not a lightweight MX5 engine, which includes removing the power steering and air conditioning brackets, and then from the back the idle air control valve, which I'll be making a blanking plate for this on the 3D printer. A nice little tech tip here is always keep some cat litter handy in the garage. I had a bit of an oil spillage come from the back of the crankshaft where the flywheel bolts would usually seal up. Previously used rags, newspaper, all sorts for mopping up oil, but the cat litter is a very economical and quick solution. It's not expensive, a couple of pounds for a 5 litre bag if you go to the bigger supermarkets, and it's reusable. With all the unneeded components taken off the engine, I just go around with a wire brush and quickly clean everything up. Take care to block any ports up using rags or tape wherever you can, just to stop dirt getting in anywhere you don't want it to. So that's about as clean as she's getting for now. Those who know me know that my driving style tends to go through a couple of engines, so pointless spending too much time on it, but we'll make it as nice as we can really for minimal time. I'll pull the pulleys off, put those through the shot blast, and then while we're at it, this front part of the crank pulley, that's redundant, so I'll cut that off to save a bit of weight, so I'm just going to throw a bit of black on it now. You can see the difference that a couple of hours will make. It's not perfect, I'll never claim it to be, but it looks a lot tidier than it was before. I'm just going to pull the gearbox out now and give that a similar sort of treatment. I'll clean up inside the bell housing as well. It's not something that anybody else will ever see, but it's always nice when you're picking up gearboxes or removing them to not be absolutely filthy all the time. So the next job for the Mazda MX5 conversion on the Roadster is to fit the clutch kit. Now when you're putting these on, obviously the clutch has to remain centered so that the input shaft from the gearbox will land perfectly in the middle of the clutch. You do have a little bit of play on them as a general, but you want to get it somewhere pretty close, otherwise you're just going to end up fighting it during assembly. What I've managed to find here is a clutch tool that I've used previously that centers a Volkswagen Beetle clutch. You can see there's still a little bit of play on it, so what I'm actually going to do is just put a bit of, I mark roughly where it lands, and then I'm just going to put a bit of tape around there to try and get it a little bit more centered. You can buy a tool for this, but if you're doing as many different weird and wonderful things as I am, it's alright if you're using it every day to do MX5s, but if you're doing a different clutch kit all the time, you just end up forking out money for things that you don't necessarily use more than once. So I've got somewhere near there. I'm happy enough with that. The thing to note, obviously, you want to be putting a little bit of Loctite on these just to stop them coming out. So I've just had a quick look online and it looks like we're coming back at 25 Newton meters for the pressure plate bolts here. Little tip that I do here, you see I always kind of put the socket on across the clutch, so when I'm tightening, the clutch is trying to spin this way whilst I'm trying to tighten that way. So if you see, if I put my socket on like this and then lever up here, it's really hard to hold it steady. Whereas if you put the socket on like so, I can probably easily hold that whilst I torque it up. So it's just a little tip, I use that for everything. I use it whilst I'm undoing wheel nuts. Anything that's basically spinning just saves you having to lock out the flywheel to do a job like this. The back piece on the fork, I always like to just put a little bit of grease on there, just stops any squeaks, that sort of thing coming back. To leave the grease open.
And then of course I just gave the boot a good clean down as well and put that through the ultrasonic cleaner. Might be better off putting the boot on first. Inside the throat bearing there, just put a tiny little bit of grease. Now, I've not assembled one of these before, so go easy with me. But I do think, yeah, it just kind of twists into place. And there we are, there you have it. So now when you push your clutch down, the throat bearing pushes up against the clutch pressure plate. All feels good. Now we're ready to put the box onto the engine. The gearbox should go on relatively straightforward now with a little bit of wiggling around. Just make sure that you're lined up with the locating pins that go between the engine and gearbox. Chuck a couple of bolts in there if you have to, just to locate things, but don't force anything too tight or you will damage some of the casting. I'd usually leave as much off the engine and gearbox until the engine's inside the car, just to save weight and give a little bit of extra room when going in. However, the starter motor tucks nicely up against the block, so I'm not concerned that that's going to cause me any problems here. So I'll give you a quick overview of the engine, where we're at the moment. I'm not overly happy about the intake, how that's come out. I got what corrosion I could off that. The rocker covers and everything else seems to look a lot better. I just put a coat of clear lacquer over the top of the entire engine just to give it some form of protection. And onto the exhaust manifold, I'm just going to take that off quickly and try and pull out a couple of the dents that are on the tube from the first cylinder. You can see there that I've pulled the majority of the dents out. It looks a damn sight better than it did before. It's good enough for what I'm after for this car. I was trying to get as many jobs done as I could without having the engine actually in the car. A friend of mine, Alex, has an MX5 Engine's MGB, so I went down and borrowed that. His engine bay is similar to mine. He's gone for a similar sort of position with the engine. The only difference that's obvious there is the intake. He's using carburetors instead of fuel injection. This gave me a good opportunity to see how he's done his engine mount. Another point to note here is the Mark II and Mark 2.5 MX5s come with the 421 style headers, which flow a lot better than the early exhaust header that I'll be using. Unfortunately, the better flowing ones, you can see how they kind of direct the exhaust straight into where the footwell would go on the MGB. So as much as you could use this and there's an opportunity to get some extra power here, it doesn't really make sense for me. You can see how the early exhaust manifold I've got then comes out of the block at a sort of 45-degree angle. So what we're going to do is weld on another 45, which will take us down vertically, and then onto the bottom of that we'll put a 90-degree bend, which will take us to the back of the car. A little point to note here, if you're underneath the car, don't make the exhaust run parallel to the chassis leg. You want a slight kink on your exhaust so that it points directly towards the notch in the cross member, otherwise you're going to have to put a bend in the pipe instead. A couple of different joint types you could use, flanges, that sort of thing. What I like to do is these sprung type joints, where you weld on something onto this side of the exhaust, which I tend to use these little stainless washers, and then you put a spring on and then weld another onto the next piece of exhaust. So, and then basically it just keeps it in tension all the time. It allows, if you ground out, which with the ride height of a lot of my cars, ground out on the exhaust, it just allows a little bit of flex and forgiveness, and it doesn't add any height, whereas if you put a flange on here, generally you lose another 10 mil of ride height. So I'll just get a pair of pliers to hold those. This image just gives you an overview of how the exhaust sits. It might clarify any confusion. I bought these generic LS engine mounts with the idea that the bushes and things like that probably cost you £20–25. I bought them on the off chance that they might be somewhere near, but we're going to end up having to cut them up. But they were only, I think, £30 posted, so none of the bolt holes match up. The best orientation, I think, is with the mount like this. Just ignore how the mount looks for now because we're going to change that anyway. That the threads are a little bit gunked up, so that doesn't sit in there very well. Obviously we need to drill a hole here and then a hole around here for this bolt to go through. So take a piece of paper, and you want dirty fingers for this really, and just sort of go like that on top of the hole. Just make sure that you don't move the template as you're doing it, and that gives you the hole pattern. Hold this one in the correct orientation, and you can kind of rip through the centre with a pen. So yeah, one hole there, one hole there. Back to the engine block to see how inaccurate, to see how accurately we drilled those holes. Happy. So what I'll do now is just mark around those holes, trim the excess. We've got our plates. Another upgrade that I want to perform is changing the crankshaft sensor pickup disc, which sits behind the crankshaft pulley. To remove the pulley, you need to undo the 4 bolts that sit around the big bolt. My crankshaft pulley might look a little bit different to yours. As I mentioned, I took off the front part of the pulley, which will drive the AC and power steering. That's no longer there. If these pulleys start fighting you a bit and you feel like using excess force with a bearing puller, if you just add a little bit of heat with a blowtorch, sometimes that helps. I've already had mine off, so it came off relatively easily. The main reason for changing this pickup then, so if you look at the original pickup disc, there's only 4 pickup points for the crankshaft sensor around the outside, these tiny little teeth. I'm swapping that out for a 36 tooth style design. This gives you a lot more definition at the crankshaft pulley. It allows the engine to update 36 times per revolution instead of 4, which effectively gives you 8 times the definition. These pickup discs come back around £25, so I felt it was a worthwhile update whilst the engine was out. I'm going to put a little bit of copper grease on here, just because next time this comes apart, it'll be me that'll be reusing everything. It should only assemble one way, but just take care to clock the orientation with the locating pin on the new disc. Next under the chopping block is the alternator. There seems to be this sort of weird relocation point for the battery terminal, which is probably car specific. There might have been something in the engine bay that was in the way on the MX5. I'm all for any opportunity to get rid of a couple of grams, but in order to delete this I need to make some sort of isolation washer which will stop the body of the alternator grounding out on the new battery wire post. Whilst I'm at it, I can run the wire that links from the starter motor connection to the alternator. I don't have the tool for these larger crimps, so I tend to squash them in the vise and then knock in a couple of indentations with a screwdriver. I've not had one come off yet. We can tighten up the connection at the alternator, but I'll leave the starter motor end loose as there will be a jump wire that will come from the fuse box to there. Another upgrade that I've done whilst I'm at it is fitting these Audi R8 coil packs that everybody calls them. They're just a generic Audi coil pack which come from the 2000s to maybe 2015 cars. If you go to a breaker's yard you can pick up 4 of these and a couple of spares as well for less than £10, which makes them cheaper than the original style coil pack. The advantages of going coil on plug mean that if you do lose a coil pack that you're not going to be stuck at the side of the road because you'll still have 3 other ones that will get you home. Also these are popular with turbocharged engines because they supply slightly stronger spark. I've included the part number here just in case it's of use to anybody. There are 2 types, a long and a short, so make sure you get the correct ones. I've done as much prep work as I could over the last few weeks, but as the car's now off the road having the 4-link fitted, I may as well start the engine swap at the same time. A huge thanks to Ben here for helping me get the engine and gearbox out in a little over an hour.
What is it?
There's nothing wrong with that radiator, it's fine.
It's resellable.
What's that that's come through? Is that one of the fins, or is that something that's come through? Or something? Oh.
The tie wrap that you stole your dodgy little fan on, isn't it?
I wasn't going to say anything because I'm too ashamed. I'm too ashamed to admit. Over the years, I've strapped many engines using seat belts to pick them up with the engine hoist, but the best tool that we made for this was a piece of flat bar with a kink in it, 2 holes drilled so that you can screw in where the rocker cover would usually attach. This is similar to a factory tool that you could actually buy. I wasn't too keen to try this the first time, but we've used this to remove maybe 10-15 engines over the years and not had any problems. I wasn't planning to do a full refurb of the engine bay, but after a good spray of degreaser, it became apparent there was quite a lot of rust that might want treating. So whilst I'm at it, I might as well take out the pedal box and the heater for refurb. So this is really good news. The majority of this is solid, it's just filthy. I'm just concerned that that might be rotting away, but it just wants to clean up and it'll be fine. There's a lot of dirt and dust in this corner. You can see there's a couple of these nutshells. So when I got this car, these were absolutely brimmed, and I mean brimmed, full on both sides, all the way across the front as well there. There'd been a squirrel living in the car, and it had just, well, you can see, look at all the nuts here, and there's some there. I'm not exaggerating the amount. I'll see if I can find some old footage, but the amount of nuts that I pulled out of this car are unbelievable. With the brake servo, the easiest way I found to delete it, so where the master cylinder bolts onto the other side of the servo, I cut this area out so we've got the correct mounting flange. So that would bolt on there as normal. And then what we're going to do, we're going to delete that because they're heavy and I don't like them. And then the pedal box, that area that we cut off, gets welded onto there like that. And that allows us then to go straight onto the master cylinder to the pedal box. Servos inside have this giant spring. I've cut that out because it might be useful for a project in the future. After fixings and everything else, we're probably around 1.9 kilo. Another piece that needs modifying to make everything work correctly is the linkage between the pedal and the master cylinder. Here you can see how that fits with the new setup. We're now at a point where we can pop the engine in just to see how everything sits. I will be trying to locate the engine as low and far back as possible, but I would like the sump to remain higher than the cross member just from a safety point of view. Initially I managed to get this into the car by myself, but as I wasn't using the leveler, I injured my back during the process, so I called in a last minute favour from the BSC team, an elite group of graduates that I went to university with. We had a bit of a thrash day on the car, ticking quite a lot off the list, but mainly the chassis and subframe notch, which allowed us to finish the engine mounts and the gearbox cross member. You know exactly what you're doing?
Always, mate.
Rory and Jarvis doing dashboard and ECU mounting.
Trying.
And then Joe's become part of the boot.
It's awful, isn't it?
Lee and myself then proceeded to spend the next 20 minutes trying to remove this front left wheel. For some reason the track width of the MG wouldn't allow the engine hoist to go through, despite having performed that manoeuvre multiple times the day before. The weight of the car meant that the wheel, when we were trying to undo the hub nuts, was just spinning. Unfortunately we couldn't press the brake pedal because there was no brakes on the car, so it kind of fought us, but eventually we got that off and then we hit the ground rolling again. Once the engine was back out, we could fully finish the engine mounts and get those bolted up for the final time.
You're professional.
Okay, so for the gearbox mount, we've got some 50x50 section, and then we've drawn a line in, which is, save other people measuring, 10mm down from the top, and we're going to cut all the way across there, 50mm from the back. We're going to cut all the way across there and weld this piece into that, and then we're using Land Rover engine mounts as a gearbox mount. So that's what we've chopped. So that's like that, and then Jarvis will demonstrate.
It's gonna be
Yeah, and then that's where the thing's going to mount to, and then we'll just start to patch some corners and then cut it nice, yeah.
Yes, around here I think it will be.
This just shows you the final gearbox crossmember design. You could probably make this lighter, but for simplicity and cost, this was the fastest way I could make this. You can see here there's about a finger's gap on the back to the heater box, and also about a finger's gap to the crank pulley at the front. It's also possible to see the notch that we've put in for the alternator. Excuse those sketchy tack welds, but you can also see how the engine mount was notched to allow the steering column to fit there. This also shows the position of the gearbox shifter. You can get the engine to fit in without any of these modifications, I'm told. However, I wanted the engine as low and far back in the car from a handling point of view. For the Land Rover Defender engine mounts that we were using for a gearbox mount, the thread size is an M10. These holes in the gearbox are around 12mm. What I did was buy some of these thread adapters which convert an M10 to an M14, and then I ran an M14 tap through the bottom of the gearbox, which will allow us to screw the mount straight into the gearbox. Back in with the engine for the last time now. You can see here I've covered the engine and gearbox in some old rags, in this case towels, just to try and stop some scratches occurring during installation. Onto the gearbox crossmember, you can see how that new threaded adapter screws into the gearbox lovely. The crossmember goes on afterwards using the original 4 mounting holes. I opted for a replacement aluminium radiator. As you saw earlier, the brass copper unit that was previously installed was a little bit past it. So the radiators from the earlier cars, the advantage of going to that obviously is you get the inbuilt expansion tank. The angle that the outlet comes off at the top, it just doesn't work really well with the MX5 setup. So I've just cut that off and I'm going to risk running it without a bead there, but worst case, what I've done in the past is just gone round and welded some little blobs on to make like your own bead. The bottom one wants cutting off even shorter, but it gives you the direct shoot over. They do come on with a piece that comes up, but I'm OCD with pipes looking nice, trying to keep everything running as straight as possible. The early radiators with the expansion tanks built in do clear the MGC type bonnet. They won't clear an MGB bonnet. You can see what I've done on the bottom here is just grind away a little bit of the original radiator and put a piece of rubber on there where it sits onto the chassis leg, just to try and mount the radiator lower and get as much clearance to the bonnet as possible. I've only opted to use the 2 fasteners for now, the top and bottom ones. I might add a 3rd fastener in the middle later, but what I'm going to do is put the original sort of style tie bars that go to the slam panel, I'm going to remake out of aluminium, and just see how strong everything feels and see if it warrants having the extra fasteners in there. And the only other thing that you'll have noticed is I've left these bolts long with the idea that there'll be a bracket that goes across and the fan will sit on the back there. And a little bit of weight we managed to get off was on this alternator bracket. They usually come round to about here somewhere, and there's this like elaborate linkage that basically just holds the alternator in check. Chopped all that off and gone old school with the bolt through there. Here's an overview of how the engine bay is looking at the moment. You can see the brake master cylinder bolts onto the pedal box lovely. I've still got all of that to refit on the inside, but I just wanted to check clearance against the intake manifold. And of course the update that everybody's been waiting for, the overall weight saving this week. You can see there from the engine and gearbox alone we saved 72.4 kilos, and then the overall weight saving including the brake booster and the radiator changes were at 78.2 kilos. I still have a few other tricks up my sleeve, so I'm confident we'll hit between 100 and 150 kilo in total weight saving from this conversion. I hope you enjoyed watching part 1 of this installation. Stay tuned for the next one. Thanks for watching.